semester, but today we're coming to you at a special time to present something that's a special topic for us. Today, we will be sharing about reading comprehension and the applications of reading standards. We're excited to present this information to you this morning because in field review in the 2023 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards are being reviewed, one question we consistently received was, I understand where phonics and fluency and print concepts and phonemic awareness all live, but where does comprehension live? So presenting this session to you this morning, we'll also have a follow-up session in a few months where we're just going to look at where does reading comprehension truly live in our South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards, and that's in the applications of reading. My name this morning, and always I hope, but my name is Mandy Hawker, and I'm the Elementary ELA Education Associate with the Office of Assessment and Standards. With me this morning, I have a colleague, Angie Neal, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey there, my name is Angie Neal, and I'm with the Office of Special Education Services. I'm a speech language pathologist by background, but I'm also in charge of early language and literacy for our office.
All right. Angie was also an integral part in the standards writing process. She served on the advisory committee as a representative for early childhood, but also for that special education lens. So it's great to have her here because she is also an expert in these ELA standards. So before we get started, let's do just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see the QR code here, and in the chat, you'll also see dropped a link to our landing page. On that landing page, we'd like for you to access the first link to fill out our attendance. So our attendance helps us to keep track of who we are reaching in the state and what roles and what types of locations and what types of districts we are supporting so that we can kind of capture that information for our planning and next steps. But then also, after you fill out that attendance, if you will drop some of that information in the chat, just for our awareness as we're presenting today, to kind of know who's in the room and who are you representing today. So if you'll drop your name, your role, and your district into the chat, we would appreciate that. We'll give you just a minute to do that. Okay, now I don't see the chat, but I hope that we are getting some of that information and my colleagues can kind of check that out and see who we have represented today. But let's go ahead and get started with our purpose. So our purpose today is presented to you a little differently. Usually we have it written out in words, but today I wanted to give you something to think about. So one statistic that is consistently resonating in our ears here at the South Carolina Department of Education is that only 54% of students in South Carolina scored meets or exceeds on SC Ready. So when we think about that in our classrooms, that's like taking each student and flipping a coin to see whether they would be reading on grade level, that meet or exceeds. So learning and achieving on grade level. And for me, when I think about the students that I supported, I think about the students in my church and community, and I think about my own child, a flip of a coin is not a good enough statistic for me, for the students in South Carolina, and the students that I love and the students I support. So our purpose today is to think about how we can contribute to reading comprehension success for those students in South Carolina so that potentially more than 54% of our students are going to be at that meets or exceeds level on SC Ready. I think that also, though, translates to our students being successful for life. And so, what can we do as practitioners or supporters of South Carolina's classrooms to figure that out? And I think that's to first educate ourselves, but then inform our practice. And so, for me, that's my conviction and my purpose for being here today. So when we think about that, let's let actually put legs on that statistic and on that purpose. And let's think about our success criteria. We'll be successful today if our participants can identify one next step to implement the learning that we talk through with success criteria and comprehension. But we'll also be successful if our participants can identify the comprehension skills that are embedded in those applications of reading in order to laser focus on those to support the comprehension of our students. So let's take a look at our agenda today. We only have 3 short pieces, right? So the first piece is just defining reading comprehension. What does that look like for students in South Carolina? Then we'll move into looking at just a few reading comprehension strategies that are embedded within the applications of reading strand. And then finally, we'll close with some clarity and closure. Now, as we dive into that first section, I want you to take a look at this quote. I'm going to give you a full minute to read it. When we think about the 54% of students who are at meet or exceed on SC Ready in South Carolina in ELA, we also have to think about the 46%. The 46% are those that would read, that reading would be a frustrating, pointless exercise for. Respond in the chat of how you feel about those 46% of students engaging in that frustrating, pointless exercise in word calling. How does that make you feel? Casey Prince Harvey, when we have 2 responses, can you share out what you see in the chat?
Yep, I'm seeing currently 2 responses: frustrated, overwhelmed, heartbreaking, discouraged, concerned, stressed. I see responsible,
Oh,
concerning,
goodness.
sad, isolating for students. Lots of similar responses there.
Thank you, Casey. So I think we can all identify that we have a problem, right? And we have tried for years to figure out ways to support that or work around that or put band-aids on it or dig in and exercise work and trying to move the needle forward, right? Um, However, with these new ELA standards, we feel like we have the perfect opportunity to really focus in and dive deep and dig deep into these standards and indicators in order to support students on reading and in reading comprehension so that we don't have students who are entering our classrooms at 46% that are frustrated, that feel like reading is a pointless exercise, and that are developing that effect on their lives. So again, let's take another look. Here's another scenario for you to consider. Have you ever seen reading in your classroom where the accuracy of the words did not equal comprehension in student behavior? They called the words, they read every word correctly, but they didn't comprehend what they read. Anybody have that happen? I had that a lot in first grade. Okay, let's take another one. How about they understand everything you read to them? Any books that they hear on tape, any that they have read to them with the apps on their computer. But when they go to read, accuracy's not there. Of course, we see that as well, right? What about they can recall what happened in the story? They can tell it back to you, the character, the action, the setting, the beginning, middle, end. They can tell you all about the details, but they don't comprehend the theme. Don't comprehend how the character changes as a result of the plot. Yes, we see all of these scenarios in our classrooms, and they're crippling because we're doing our very best. We're following our curriculum. We're walking through our pacing guide. We're delivering the best instruction that we have, but we're still seeing these gaps and these issues in our classrooms. Well, Angie's going to talk to us a little bit about why that might be.
All right, so I'm super excited to sort of kick this off by introducing what's referred to as the simple view of reading. And the simple view of reading is similar to like Einstein's equals MC squared. It's just a simple view or simple explanation for how children learn to read. And currently, the simple view of reading by Goff and Tunmer is the only accepted model through the research and through the evidence in terms of how students do learn to read. And so what the simple view of reading states is that word recognition multiplied by language comprehension is how we get to reading comprehension. And so the two components are word recognition and language comprehension, and you have to have both of those in order to get to reading comprehension. That explains why this is multiplicative. So if you look at the chart, the table below, what you see is that if you have word recognition, if you can read the words, but you can't understand the words, will you be able to achieve reading comprehension? No. By the same token, what if you can't decode the words? You can't read the words, but if somebody read it aloud to you, you could comprehend it. Would you get to reading comprehension? No, you wouldn't. All right, well, what about if you have a little bit of word recognition, a little bit of decoding skills, and you have a little bit of language comprehension skills? Would you get to reading comprehension? No, you'd end up with a little bit of reading comprehension. So again, that's why you have to have word recognition skills, language comprehension skills, both of those in order to get to reading comprehension. So the question that is logical to ask next is, okay, word recognition. All right, what does that include? Language comprehension. What does that include? So for that, we turn to another research-based model for how children learn to read, which is referred to as Scarborough's reading rope. And it builds on the simple view of reading by saying, okay, word recognition includes these sets of skills. That includes phonological awareness. It includes decoding and encoding, which requires things such as alphabetic principle. It requires phonics patterns, and it requires both, again, reading and spelling, that encoding and decoding. It also requires sight recognition, which is not the same thing as sight words. What that means is that automaticity, that ability to lift all words, not just sight words, but all words off of the page effortlessly. Now, in terms of language comprehension, what does that include? And this is the more abstract one. So language comprehension includes background knowledge, what you bring to the text. It includes vocabulary, which we're going to go really in depth on today. It includes language structures, which includes syntax and morphology, as well as how semantics, how we put words together. It also includes verbal reasoning. That's our inference and prediction and metaphors and other figurative language. And of course, literacy knowledge. So knowledge of print concepts and genre. Now, how does this model, both models, the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, how does that overlap with the federal law for comprehensive literacy instruction, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act? Well, the Every Student Succeeds Act states that comprehensive literacy instruction means age-appropriate, explicit, systematic, and intentional instruction in these 6 areas: phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, language structures, which is syntax and morphology, fluency, that automatic word recognition, and of course, comprehension. So I've drawn arrows to point out where that word recognition, what it includes from ESSA. That includes phonological awareness, phonics, and that fluency, that automatic word recognition. And I did the same thing for the language comprehension strand. In there, we see vocabulary, the language structures, the exact wording from ESSA. Fluency, again, is also in there because what the what Scarborough's reading rope talks about is that as both strands, word recognition and language comprehension, as they both become more automatic, then their automaticity and fluency with reading increases. So it's got to really be in both places. And then, of course, comprehension. Now, how does this align with our South Carolina CCR ELA standards? Well, we see that our overarching expectations include that background knowledge. We see that our applications of reading includes vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. We see that our foundations of literacy covers all of those word recognition strands. So there's a perfect overlap between all of them. Now, let's dig deep into that language comprehension piece. So if we look again at that simple view of reading equation, WR is word recognition, LC is language comprehension equals RC, which is reading comprehension. Now, word recognition, that's all going to fall within your foundations of literacy strand. But what is language comprehension? Well, again, that's why I'm here as a speech language pathologist to share what I know about language and how this works within both the Simple View and Scarborough's reading rope. So there are 6 facets of language, and each one of these facets has a profound impact on literacy. So those 6 facets includes phonology, which is your phonological awareness. Morphology, which we're going to break down some more in a little bit if you're not familiar with that term, but that's those individual units of meaning. Semantics, and that's really just a fancy word for vocabulary. Syntax, another fancy word that really just means sentence structure, how we put words together to form phrases and sentences. Discourse and narrative, so narrative skills really relating to the ability to tell a story and write a story. This is going to become very important from 3rd grade on, but what I want you to really appreciate is how important narrative is to develop from that oral language foundation first and how that is already part of our standards. And then, of course, pragmatics, which we don't tend to think about in terms of language comprehension, but pragmatics includes perspective taking. Pragmatics includes being able to pick out which details are important and which details are not important. So it's not just social skills, it's so much more than that. So all of those are the facets of language. And I want you to look at that second bullet point, which says that literacy is the secondary system, and it is dependent on language. Language being the primary system, meaning that when children come to school, they come with language that they've been hearing and speaking. And now our role is to teach what that language looks like in print. Because whether you speak it or you read it or you write it, it's all language. And how does language overlap again with Scarborough's reading rope? Again, making sure we see that consistency between what we're talking about and the research. With semantics, again, that's that fancy word for vocabulary. Morphology and syntax, that's your language structures. Pragmatics includes that verbal reasoning, the inference, the prediction, the ability to think about somebody else's perspective. Discourse and narrative, that falls in literacy knowledge. And of course, phonology and morphology relate to phonology, phonological awareness, and decoding. Now, why is morphology on there twice? Well, morphology, if you think about it, relates specifically to how you add words, or excuse me, add morphemes to words. And there are specific phonic patterns that guide how we're able to do that. So there's a pattern that says when you should double the final consonant before you add the morpheme, or the pattern for when do you drop the final E when you're adding an additional morpheme. So that's all phonic patterns. So that's why it goes in both places. So I love reading research. I love it, love it, love it. And so I'm more than happy to share it any chance that I get, but I'm going to condense it in several places just to a quick 1-minute research review, because I want you to truly appreciate how important it is that we rely on science, that we rely on research to help us understand our practice and help us to make sure our practice is effective. So here's your quick 1-minute research review on all of the facets of language in general. So language comprehension is intricately related to reading comprehension. And we saw that as part of the simple view of reading. Word recognition multiplied by language comprehension. That's how we get to reading comprehension. And by third grade, children's language skills, that's what explains about 60% of the variance in their comprehension. Because at that point, they should be more fluent decoders. So now that's when language comprehension really becomes a key aspect of reading comprehension. And that's what the third bullet speaks to, that once they're competent at decoding, it's that language comprehension. That's what determines reading ability and also what those potential challenges may be. So now let's talk about the difference between comprehension skills versus comprehension strategies. And this is very, very important that we think about and that we talk about, because what we know is that the effectiveness of reading comprehension strategies, it's been the subject of over 500 different studies in the past 25 years. This is well-discussed information. And the simple conclusion that comes from all of this body of work is that yes, strategy instruction improves comprehension. That said, there's more difficult questions to answer than just that, such as how much do the strategies help? How do these strategies actually help them? Do all students benefit from strategy instruction? And how much time should we spend on strategy instruction? So reading strategies in particular do not build reading skill, but reading strategies are what indirectly improve reading comprehension. So let's break down what the different skills are. Well, those skills, your comprehension skills, are all of the ones that we just listed under Scarborough's reading group, under language comprehension. Again, building background knowledge, connecting new knowledge to previous knowledge, understanding vocabulary, using sentence structure and organization to make sense of the text, making inferences, all of those different things. Now, what is strategy? Well, reading strategies are skills that are learned through that gradual release of responsibility. And those are deliberate, very goal-directed attempts to arrive at meaning. Goal-directed, deliberate attempts, which is different from skills because skills should be automatic. So these are goal-directed, deliberate attempts. And so these include comprehension monitoring, question generating, use of graphic organizers, answering questions, summarizing, and identifying text structures, features, and language. Now, what you see highlighted in yellow here, those are the ones we're going to dig into a little bit deeper in this session today. But we're going to start with this. There is no comprehension strategy that can make up for the fact that you can't read the words. One more time, there's no comprehension strategy that can make up for the fact that you can't read the words. So let's see how you do with this passage. Can you read these words? And if not, will you be able to comprehend it? No, but let's see what happens if I read it to you. And this is one of my all-time favorite passages. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is, or woman, who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who comes up short again and again, who at best knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst fails while daring greatly. That's the Man in the Arena speech from Theodore Roosevelt, and I abbreviated it a little bit so that it would all fit together there. But again, that's why strategy instruction is the most ideal for 4th grade and up, and or those who are proficient readers. I'm going to say that one more time because it's sometimes contrary to what we think. But strategy instruction is the most ideal or the strongest for students who are fourth grade and up or those who are proficient readers. And let me explain that a little bit further. Most younger age students, they're still acquiring word recognition skills, and they're still becoming fluent enough to comprehend what they read while they read it. So all of this is tied directly to the fact, too, if we look at their developmental progression. At younger ages, their attention skills, their working memory skills, and even their capacity for how much memory they can hold on to at one time is not that far along yet. So what happens is if we're asking them to apply strategies while they're still decoding, while they're still becoming fluent at that, what's going to happen is their ability to do that is very limited to do that independently. Let me say that again, to do it independently. So that's where all of this, I hope, makes a lot of sense and starts to come together. So now we're going to stop and pause and respond and think about all of that information that I just shared, because it was a lot of heavy information. So I want to pause here just to make sure we can reflect and think about it. So the first question I want you to think about, and even type something in the chat as you have thoughts about it, are how, now that you know the Simple View and Scarborough's reading rope, how might that now help us better inform our instruction? The second question to pause and ponder on would be, how does this understanding of skills versus strategies inform our instruction? Anybody have thoughts on any of these? Any questions about any of these so far? All right, I see we need to make sure that students can do both. Ooh, I love this one. How important intentional planning needs to be. Oh, absolutely. Simple View Scarborough's, yes, that's in letters. Yes, so a lot of times when I do this presentation live, I will ask how many of you in the audience are familiar with the Simple View, and I love to be the first person to introduce it if you've not heard it yet. Yes, this distinction between skills versus strategies is very important. And actually, we're going to, spoiler alert, we're going to do a part 2 of reading comprehension because, of course, we won't be able to get to all of it today. And so in the next one, we're going to talk about comprehension processes as opposed to comprehension products and what we're really looking at when we talk about comprehension processes and products. Yes, great feedback. Skills versus strategies, and that developmental readiness for what are they able to do?
All right, so we've built your knowledge, right? Or we've reminded you of things that you already knew. We brought that back to the forefront of your mind in regard to reading comprehension. And I feel like we have a good, solid, shared understanding of what is reading comprehension, how do we get to it, and then what is the difference in reading skills versus reading strategies. So now let's think about reading comprehension strategies in our applications of reading strand. As South Carolina Public School employees, we are tied to fidelity to our 2023 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards. With that fidelity comes a burden of knowing those standards. And so that's kind of our next section where we're going to focus in on a few of the standards and indicators and really understand the reading comprehension embedded within those indicators and standards. So let's get started. You've probably seen this graphic before. This is a screenshot of just a part of our standards map from the 2023 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards. This is a screenshot of just the applications of reading strand. Within that strand, there are 10 standards. Now, we won't cover all 10 standards today or all 14 indicators, but we are going to focus in on just 6 of those today. So let's look at the three that we'll focus on. We're going to take a look at vocabulary. Now, vocabulary is an effective reading strategy that can be found in AOR 7.1, 8.1, and 9.1. Next, we're going to take a look at text structure and text features, which can be found in AOR 5.1 and 5.2. And then finally, our other strategy focus today is going to be on summarization, which can be found in AOR 6.1. So I'm going to turn it back over to Angie, as vocabulary is our first focus and is her expertise.
Yes. So I love to talk about vocabulary. I could talk about it all day. As a speech language pathologist, I like to say words are us. Like, this is exactly what we do, what we focus on. So we're going to look very specifically at what those specific vocabulary standards are and which specific aspect of vocabulary do they address. So 7 addresses determining the clarity, the meaning of unknown words, how we learn new words, also multiple meaning words and phrases. 8, applications of reading 8, analyzes word relationships and nuances in word meanings within literary and informational texts. And 9 addresses building and applying a range of vocabulary, as well as grade level appropriate morphology. Told you we'd come back to that, and applying that to our reading, writing, and speaking. So here's our 1-minute review of the research about vocabulary. So children learn new words by making connections to words and concepts they already know. So in short, what that means is you have to know something to learn something. So we have to appreciate the level of vocabulary that your students are coming to your classroom with, or maybe not, and what we might need to do to supplement that. We also know from the research that students need multiple exposures to a word to learn it well. So it's not just seeing it in the text, but also hearing it and hearing it over and over again, and then seeing it in lots of different texts. We also know from the research that students must understand 90 to 95% of the words on a page in order to understand the content. So I want you to think about, when was the last time you read something where you didn't know or weren't familiar with or couldn't decode, because you can't get meaning from words you can't decode, 90 to 95% of the words on the page? And we've got a little activity for you. So this is what 75% of words known looks like. So I'm going to give you the accommodations of reading it aloud, and we'll see how you do comprehension. So is marking a on a measuring. This involves the relationship between of a measuring and or which must be For example, placing a in melting ice to see whether it reads 0 to check it has been correctly. Here's your pop quiz. What is needed to mark a scale on a measuring instrument? What would be an example of calibration? What is the relationship between indications of measuring instruments and reference values that must be applied? How'd you do? And that's only with 75% of words known. So again, that really helps to illustrate how important it is that students understand 90 to 95% of the words on the page and decode them so that they can get that meaning. So now let's talk about what we really mean when we talk about vocabulary. So when working on the standards, one of the main questions we got a great deal was when we were sending it out for public comment was, is there going to be a vocabulary list by grade level? Well, there is not one agreed upon list for vocabulary by age or grade. And there's a very important reason for that. And that is that we have to remember that children learn words by making connections to words they already know. Again, they have to know something to learn something. So while there is not an agreed upon list of vocabulary words, there is a general agreement in the research that words can be broken down or categorized into different tiers. And these tiers are broken up according to words that are commonly found in our spoken language. So words that everybody just about in the whole world uses on an everyday basis, such as dog or truck or Chick-fil-A. Those are words that are very common to just about every single person. Now, that's tier 1, and that's the majority of our words. Tier 2, those are words that are very frequently found or more frequently found in text. This is what our authors use to paint a very clear picture of what's going on. So they might use words like splendid or famished or absurd. And those are not words that we would necessarily use in our everyday conversation. Now, tier 3 words, that is the smallest of the words, and that is highly specific curricular terms. And this is what we tend to think about when we think vocabulary. We think these types of specific words, such as isosceles, transcontinental, entomology, cumulus, nimbus, all of those highly curricular terms. But we're going to hang out for a moment on tier 2 because this is your sweet spot for instruction. This is that sweet spot for accessing the meaning. So here's an example from one of my favorite books, which is Click Clack Moo. So even in just picture books such as Click Clack Moo, what you see here is the author's use of tier 2 words. For example, instead of just saying the cows stopped making milk, that's how we would say it in conversation, the author says the cows went on strike. So strike would be that tier 2 word. Another example is instead of saying how we would say it in conversation, the cows were tired of waiting for electric blankets, the author says the cows were growing impatient, tier 2 word. And also instead of saying duck didn't care either way, the author says duck was a neutral party. So that's an example of how the author is using tier 2 words and how important it is to make sure students are able to access those. Now, let's talk about applications of reading 7 and determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown words. Now, when we think about determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown words as well as multiple meaning words and phrases, a reader needs to refer to the context that the word is being used in. They need to make connections to words they know, which would be your background knowledge, and they also need to use support and reference materials such as a glossary. So here's what it actually means to know a word, and it is not just a definition. So to know a word means you also know how to pronounce it. So if you look at that word in red, do you have a lot of confidence in how to pronounce that word? So my daughter and I actually, the first time we heard these words, that word in particular, we kept going back and forth because we kept reading it in different ways. Is it cacophony or cacophony? It's cacophony. So that really, again, helps illustrate if you know the word, you know how to pronounce the word. We also have to realize how the word can be used and how it can't be used. So for example, there's a great example of an NBA basketball player, and he said that he could dribble the ball with both hands. So he said that he was amphibious, which is not the correct use of that word. So that's not how you can use that word. So again, does it make you think that they understand the meaning of that word? No, it should have been ambidextrous. It's also important that when you know a word, you know how to spell the word, because in the example there, especially how you spell it changes the meaning of the word. You also have to understand the meaning, and that's what we truly think about. But you have to understand the difference between those nuances between words, such as poisonous, which is something that if it rubs on you or sort of gets ingested, then it's toxic to you, as opposed to venomous, meaning if you get bitten. And we also have to grasp and understand those morphemes, those individual units of meaning within the word. And that's how we know that it's regardless, not irregardless, that prefix IR isn't necessary. We're not done yet. So knowing a word also means knowing the word in various contexts. So if you think about it, the word stand, just that word stand, It has 3 different meanings as a verb, and it has 4 different meanings as a noun. So if you only know just the definition or a definition, that's not going to help you understand all of the different uses and meanings of the word. We also have to realize how the meaning changes, or really that part of speech may change when you add morphemes. So what it means, the word friend, what does the word friend mean? But what does it now mean when we add that plural S? What does it now mean when we add that suffix ly? What does it now mean when we add that prefix b? So adding those morphemes changes the meaning. We also have to be able to understand how the meaning changes when we put it together with other words. So this example here comes from Mark Twain, who is famous for saying there's a big difference between lightning and a lightning bug. So that is a great example of when we pair it with another word, it does change the meaning. We also have to grasp that part of speech, not necessarily being able to say that's a verb, that's an adverb, that's a subject, that's an object, but knowing when to use which word and how it fits within a sentence, especially as we're writing, knowing whether we should use who or whom. We also have to, of course, know synonyms and antonyms for the word, and what this word looks like along a continuum. That's that nuance of meaning. So what's the difference between young and youthful versus childish? Now let's talk about applications of reading 8. And when we talk about that, now we're looking at analyzing those word relationships and those nuances of meaning. And that's where students need to know figurative language, connotative language, and technical language. So this is another one of my favorite ones to talk about. I love to talk about figurative language. I don't know if that's because we're from the Southeast, and in the Southeast, we'd use a lot of figurative language. So I'm going to give you some examples. So when we talk about figurative language, what we're really referring to is when words say one thing, but mean another. So for example, we know that rain is precipitation, okay? And we know that cats and dogs are pets. But when we put those together, rain and cats and dogs, that means something completely different than just precipitation and pets. And what it really helps to know is where these figurative language phrases, where these idioms came from. This helps solidify this meaning for students. So let me give you an example. There are lots of tools and materials out there that will show the literal meaning. So they'll have a picture of a man holding an umbrella and cats and dogs falling down from the sky. That is not helpful. That reinforces what they already thought that it meant. Instead, if we teach where this idiom comes from, it makes it make sense. And it's a story. So quick connection there for narrative. So where does raining cats and dogs come from? Well, it came back from the way back times before we had underground plumbing and sewage and all that kind of stuff. So what happened is, as it would rain very hard, there would be a whoosh of water that would go down the street. And for any critters that would happen to be in the street at that same time when it was raining very hard, what would happen is they would whoosh down the road with it. So that's where we know if it's raining very hard, it's raining cats and dogs. Same thing with weather. We know what weather is, but what about under the weather? Well, under the weather is actually a sailing term. It comes from sailing. And what it means is that when a sailor would get sick, they would go below deck. They were technically under the weather. So that's where that comes from. And another great story for skeleton versus skeleton in the closet. Well, before the United Kingdom passed the 1832 Anatomy Act, which gave grave robbers essentially the ability, or gave doctors and physicians the ability to study the human body, because before that, they were not able to open up the human body and study it. So what they had was they had grave robbers who would go and steal bodies, but so they wouldn't be found out, they would hide these bodies in the closet until they could then pass them along to the physicians that they could study them. Now, Let's move on, and now let's talk about vocabulary and mental imagery. This, I can tell you as a speech language pathologist, is probably one of the biggest areas of impact that I see in students who struggle with language comprehension and reading comprehension. And mental imagery, just a short version of what that is that really just means that ability to make that mental picture in your mind. So for example, if I say, picture your cat or your dog or your car or your bedroom, you could probably close your eyes and see a very clear picture of it. Well, for a lot of students, they don't have that skill yet, but it is teachable and it's critical to reading comprehension because what we know is it's not just the meaning of the individual words, because that only accounts for about 50 to 60% of the variation in reading comprehension. So we really need to think not just about meaning in single words, but also these relationships and that ability to create those mental images. So here's a quick check that you can do to see if your students are struggling with mental imagery. So first, give them a series of pictures. Doesn't have to be these in particular, but just show them a series of pictures and say, point to a statue, a globe, gems, hibernate, all of those kind of things. If they know and can point to those, that tells you they've got them in there. They've got that word in there somewhere. But next, ask them to tell you 3 things about their dog, their cat, their bedroom, their car, something that should be very, very familiar to them. If they give you this look, complete blank stare, that's telling you there's not that mental imagery there. And that's something we're going to have to help build and scaffold. Because essentially, what we're doing when we read is we're making mental movies. We're making mental movies as we read. So I told you that I'm a big reader of research. I really am. I read a ton of nonfiction all about language and literacy to the point that it's very annoying for my husband. But that's what I love to read. But the last book that I read that was fiction, I vividly remember making these mental movies as I read. You're putting together what you think the characters look like based on the author's description, what you think they do or how they move or what that background looks like, that setting. So we're building these mental movies. And we build these mental movies not based on single words, but how we put those mental images together based on the phrases. So that's where I want to introduce the idea of scooping. So for example, of course, this passage comes from Charlotte's Web, because I'm not familiar of any other books that have a main character of Fern, but we don't want to just picture Fern and what Fern looks like. We need to make those connections between these phrases, such as Fern pushed the chair out of the way. Do we mentally make that movie of she just pushed the chair out of the way or she pushed the chair out of the way? Because that's a different image. And then scoop the next phrase. So Fern pushed the chair out of the way is one image, and ran outdoors, that's a whole different image. So for example, if we know Fern and we know this setting is actually a farm, when we say she ran outdoors, what does this add to your understanding? When we think of that door in particular, what kind of door do you picture? I picture a screen door. I picture a screen door and slamming that screen door open and hearing the metal hook bounce against that wood. So all of that adds depth to that mental picture. Now, something I really want to expand on, and especially as it relates to comprehension, is we're going to build from mental images of single words to mental imagery for those phrases as we build those mental movies, and now mental models. So let me explain how critical this is to comprehension and comprehension instruction. So if you think about it, text includes what we refer to as a surface code. And that's just the literal meaning of the words and phrases on the page. So for example, if you say the cat ate a mouse, the literal interpretation would be a cat eating a mouse. But there's also a text base. The text base is that underlying knowledge, those underlying ideas that we have to assume students have. So for example, let's think about that underlying assumed idea for these two sentences. A pack of wolves roamed the valley. That text base is that assumption that students understand that it's a pack of 6 to 12 of these animals. And these animals are big, furry canines, and they're wild. They're not the same as the ones that live in your, as the dog that would live in your house. That's that underlying idea. Now, think about it from another sentence that's very similar. A pack of wolves roamed into the valley. That relies on that underlying idea or that assumption of that underlying idea that those animals are not usually in that area. They roamed into it, meaning they aren't usually there. They just sort of happened upon it. So these are those little nuances of comprehension that make a huge difference. Now, let's talk about that bigger mental model. So again, we're going mental imagery of words, mental imagery for building those movies through all the different phrases. Now let's move to that bigger idea of a mental model. And that's sometimes referred to as schema. And that is that whole mental representation of the meaning of a text. So I'm going to give you an example of this. So here we go. I'm going to read this for you, and we'll see how we do. The procedure is quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you must go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you're all set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it's better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can also be expensive as well. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they'll be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. Can you answer comprehension questions about that? You likely can answer some of the surface code questions, such as what do you do first? You arrange things in different groups. What do you do after the procedure is complete? After the procedure is complete, you arrange the materials into different groups. So that's all surface code. You can go back directly into the text and take out the literal meaning of the words. Now, you really need, in order to answer additional questions, you need to have a mental model for folding laundry. A mental model for folding laundry. And when you have a mental model of that whole concept of folding laundry, now you can answer additional comprehension questions such as how are groups organized when you're doing laundry? That's not in the text, is it? It's not. Again, it relies on that mental model. Same thing with this. What do you need to look for in a facility? Is that in the text? No, it relies on a mental model. All right, here's another one. Why would a mistake be expensive? Is that in the text? No, it relies on a mental model for folding laundry. So again, this brings us back to that original citation before, that knowledge of those individual words only accounts for 50 to 60% of the variance in reading comprehension. So I really want us to appreciate how important that ability to have that mental imagery for words, then phrases, and then the whole mental model, how that leads up to those higher level comprehension abilities. And here's your 1-minute research review. So listening and reading comprehension have been shown to correlate with visual spatial perceptual skills, which is another word for mental imagery. That's listening comprehension and reading comprehension. So even if it's being read aloud to you, so even for younger children have to be able to make these mental images as well. which then helps support that ability once they start decoding and making those mental images as they read. Nonverbal IQ measures in kindergarten. So again, that ability to see those mental images in your mind is a key predictor of 8th grade reading comprehension, and nonverbal skills in 1st grade are predictive of 5th grade reading comprehension. So again, how important this is at younger ages in order to have that impact on reading comprehension further down the road. Now let's move to applications of reading 9. And for that, now we're really going to get into the academic vocabulary and my favorite, morphology. So that includes that academic vocabulary, which, spoiler alert, much of our academic vocabulary, especially in science, is made up of Greek and Latin roots. So we're going to talk about Greek and Latin roots, morphemes, phonics, and etymology. So here's your 1-minute research review. 80% of words in English contain multiple morphemes. So when we teach these morphemes, we're teaching meaning for not just the words we're teaching, but we're unlocking the meaning for many words that we don't have to teach directly because we're teaching those individual units of meaning. And morphologically complex words, that's the bulk of unfamiliar words children encounter in text. Now, I want to start with this appreciation of the fact that English is morphophonemic. What that means is the English language is different from other languages in that it's made up of units of meaning and sounds. That's the phonology, that's the phony. So for example, let me do this backwards from what's on the slides. So what are the individual sounds for frog? F, g. So that's the phonemes. What are the individual units of meaning for these words? Well, you've got frog, that's one unit of meaning. Frogs has 2 units of meaning. So it's a frog, but that plural S means there's a bunch of them. Okay, froggy is then an adjective, and frogger is really someone who or something that is like a frog. Now, quickly, this is how English is different from other languages. So for example, Chinese, they don't write the individual phonemes. They write characters for each meaning. The same thing with sign language. Now you can fingerspell every single word in sign language, but that would take forever. So sign language is only based on meaning. So my favorite example to use is that this is Clemson and this is tiger. So we didn't pull out each of the individual phonemes, we only focused on the meaning. But in English, what we're teaching, English language, what it sounds like, what it looks like in print, we're teaching both of those. So there are 2 types of morphemes. This gets a little technical, but hang in there with me, okay? The ones we're most familiar with, those are the inflectional ones. They don't change the part of speech. Those are the ones we think about most often in terms of grammar, okay? That adding the plural S, adding past tense ED, adding present progressive ing, and even adding those comparison affixes, which would be ER and EST. Those are the ones we think of most commonly. But derivational morphemes, that does change the part of speech for the word. This has important implications for writing. For how do we know where to put that word if it's the subject versus the object versus the verb versus the adverb? So for example, we move from a verb, encourage, to a noun, encouragement, when we add that ment affix. So all of those things are important to know when we're providing instruction to students. Now let's talk about one of my favorites, which we've mentioned before, which is Greek and Latin roots. When we teach Greek and Latin roots, again, we're teaching meaning for words that students haven't even encountered yet. So your impact goes well beyond your classroom for years to come when we teach those individual Greek and Latin roots. Because Greek and Latin roots help students connect new, unfamiliar words to words they know and understand. So here's one of my favorite examples. So Well, before I get to the example, over half of all English words are derived from Greek and Latin roots. So if you know that's 50%, again, we're giving away meaning and that ability to understand them without even having you right there beside them. So my favorite example, mal. Mal is a root that means bad. So really quickly, I want to see if you could put in the chat, how many words can you think of that include the root mal? Malicious. Malicious. I see malicious popping up. Anything else? Malfunction. Malicious. I'll look at two more. Malevolent. One more. Malignant. Okay, here's some more. Malformed. Maltreatment. Malice. Malfunction. Malnourished. Malignant. Dismal. Malaria. Malpractice. And then my two favorite, Maleficent and Malfoy. Now, do you think J.K. Rowling just sort of accidentally named that character Malfoy? No, but if we know mal is actually a root that means bad, we actually then know that that character is a bad guy before he even does bad guy stuff. Now let's think about etymology. Etymology, if you're not familiar with it, is actually teaching the story behind how these words were invented. Where did they come from? So for example, there's a great online site. It's called Etym Online. So ETYM online, all one word. And you can type in any word and it will tell you the derivative. Where did this word come from? So for example, the word mortgage is based on two roots, mort, meaning death, and gage, meaning pledge. So your mortgage literally means it is a death pledge that until you die, or if you die, you're going to be paying all of this money for your house. So again, when we teach these things, it helps explain the meaning. Now, as a great example of this, I also want to connect it with spelling. So how many of you have students that ask, why does the CH not make the ch sound? Why does it sometimes make the sh sound? I'll give you the exact reason why. By doing this for me. Okay, real quick, somebody's asked me to repeat the name of the site. It's called Etym Online. ETYM ONLINE. Etym Online. There's also some etymology dictionaries. Like, I have those. I love those. Those are so much fun. All right, so now let's go back to the question about when CH makes the sh sound. So to answer that, I want a few of you to type in the chat how many words, or think of a word that actually is when the CH makes the sh sound. Well, church would be when it's making its regular sound. Ch. I want to think about when CH makes it sh sound. Yes, machine. That's when CH is making the sh. Yes, charade. What's another one where CH makes the sh sound? Chef. Absolutely. Let's see if we can get two more. Chauffeur. Yes, one more. Parachute. Yes. Okay. So all of those are examples of when the CH makes the sh sound. Here's some more for you. So chef, Chardonnay, champagne, charlotte, charcuterie, quiche. Ooh, charlatan. That's a good one. Machine, parachute, chandelier, chalet, mustache. I saw somebody do that. Chartreuse, charades. Now think about those words, especially Chardonnay and champagne. Where do you think those words come from? France. Yes, those are all words that are French derivatives that we borrowed and brought into our language. So when we can teach those stories to students, that explains why the CH is making the other sound. Yes, they're French in origin. Excellent. So right now, we're going to do an activity where I want you to look at applications of reading 7.1, 8.1, and 9.1. So you see them in really small print here. But I want us to think now and engage in some dialogue about how you currently provide instruction for vocabulary. And also, how might these new standards and indicators support your instruction? So let's take a minute to look through those and then also to maybe type some of those things in the chat, or better yet, if you would maybe unmute and talk about what you have now learned that can about the standards and indicators that can help support your vocabulary instruction.
Casey Prince Harvey is going to drop into the chat a document that just contains the vertical articulations of AOR 7.1, 8.1, and 9.1. I think she's already done that. But if you'll access that document and just kind of work through your thinking, if you need that for support.
All right. Anybody want to unmute or type in the chat how these standards and indicators are going to help support that vocabulary instruction? What your thoughts are about what you've heard so far about vocabulary and these standards and indicators? I have to say, I'm ridiculously excited about them, as I'm sure you can tell. All right, how about give me a thumbs up if you feel like these new standards and indicators will help support that instruction in vocabulary. There's one. See if I can get some. Yes, another thumbs up that this will be helpful. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So somebody said in the thing that this is going to be so important. And I'll be honest, the people who, when we were writing these standards and indicators, what was so important, I think, was that the middle school teachers really talked about how critically important it is for students to come from elementary school with this knowledge. And again, I think so much about how this will really impact when students are learning science, that when we break apart words by their Greek and Latin roots and by their individual morphemes, how critical that is to not just teaching those words, but unlocking all of these words that they will encounter across their lifetime.
Angie, I'll unmute and share. When you talk about that mental imagery and making those mental movies, I remember as an early childhood practitioner doing that with my students, but I didn't understand the reasoning behind it or the impact that it had. So, can you elaborate just a little bit more on like, we know we do this practice, or I feel like it's a pretty common practice in our classrooms, but what is our purpose in making those mental images and mental movies?
Yes. Oh, I love that question. So the purpose of really guiding students or scaffolding through students through making these mental movies, it's a direct impact on their comprehension. So what you'll see in the indicators, especially in kindergarten, is we start by introducing the idea of mental imagery by first thinking about categories and the fact that words can be grouped into certain categories. So when we talk about the different categories, that now helps plant the idea that words go in certain file folders in our head. And that when we put them all in certain file folders, such as trucks go with the file of transportation, lions go with the file folder for zoo animals. When we do things like that, that makes it easier to put them in the right place so that we can retrieve them quickly and easily. But then we also, especially in those kindergarten standards, that's where we start now talking about more of the descriptive characteristics. Now we're talking about making those mental images directly, scaffolding that for them so that even in class, even if you're just reading to them, you could talk about things like a lion and put the book away and talk about how would they describe them? What is the size of a lion? What is his shape? What does the shape of his head kind of look like? What is his color? What's unique and distinctive about the way a lion looks as opposed to a tiger? So really developing and building those mental images, not only for, again, listening comprehension when they're not yet readers, but for reading comprehension when they become proficient readers. Does that answer that question?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. All right, so that was our look into the reading strategy and skill of vocabulary. Next, we're going to move into our second reading strategy, and that is the focus on text structure and text features. So one piece of research that we found was that studying text structures and features promotes reading comprehension, but also it improves writing composition. And so while our focus today is on the applications of reading and that reading comprehension, studying these text features and structures can be translated and transferred into improving writing composition as well. So let's take a look at the two standards and indicators that focus on that. AOR 5 says that we expect students to evaluate and critique how an author uses words, phrases, and text structures to craft text. 5.1, though, is where we're going to begin our focus today, and that's on text structures. So your structures, that's kind of like your skeleton that gives the shape or that organizes the ideas within a text. It makes it clear to understand the author's meaning. It helps the student focus as they're reading. It helps the students with their own writing because of that transfer over to their writing. But how do we teach text structures most effectively? Well, we're going to talk about two different ideas. And the first is showing students examples. So we know that, right? We are reading a book. We share the text structure in that text, or we share the text structure in that book with the students, pointing out the different components and aspects of it. But also, we can teach that by using graphic organizers. Now, 5.1 particularly mentions the literary text structure. So when we talk about this is a little different than maybe we've discussed it in the past. We're talking about the structures of what a prose piece might look like, a poem, or a drama. So let's take a look at some examples of how you might teach that in your classrooms. So we could make a graphic organizer similar to the one on the left, where we talk about, well, what is prose? Prose are those like narrative stories that are written in paragraph form. What is a drama? That's a story that's written in a script. And what is poetry? Poetry is stories that are written in as verse, maybe with stanzas or numbered lines with some kind of rhyme or rhythm. So by organizing your ideas on text structure in this graphic organizer, it gives students those categories to place text that they encounter on a regular basis. Again, you'll see on the right side a anchor chart of something similar to what you might use in your classroom, where you name the three literary structures that are mentioned in our ELA standards: poetry, drama, and prose, and the different components of those. Doing this helps your student to kind of build that structure in their mind of what are text structures that I'm going to encounter and how can I recognize that structure as I encounter it while I'm reading. Okay, 5.2 deals with text features. Now, text features we know are important because of their relationship to reading comprehension. Without text features, readers are left to determine the organization and locate important information all by themselves. So text features pull that information out and organize it in different ways for readers to encounter. Now, if students are taught to use text features, that can deepen their understanding when reading. Oftentimes in text, we encounter text features that present more information than is in the body of the text. Maybe it's not in the paragraphs, but you do find that information in the text features. And because of that, that can lead to very complex, I'm trying to think of a text complexity. It can lead to challenging text complexity. So when we teach students how to encounter text features, how to use them, and how to read them, it gives them better access to the content of the text. So text features can be taught in a variety of ways, but first is through reading a variety of text. We want students to encounter text features naturally in the text that they read or the text that are read aloud to them. This can be done in all content areas as well. We also want them to experience writing text features. So this is where, again, we dip over to those communication standards. We want students to engage in the practice of writing text features themselves based on content or information that they have. We want them to reread informational text and paying attention, that close attention to text features. This can be done in the close reading protocol that we've shared in other webinars, or it could just be done with intention in small groups. Maybe you present an informational text to the class, but then you have students reread just the text feature with that intention and focus in mind. But the strategy that we're going to talk through today is a text feature walk. So on this next slide, I've listed out the protocol of a text feature walk. So I'll let you read through that. I'm going to give you just a minute to look through that, those 5 steps, then we're going to talk about them. Okay, this is an example of a condensed version of a text feature walk. If you want more information on this strategy, if you'll look in the notes section of this slide, the speaker notes, you'll see a link to the actual protocol and where we found that resource. But I want to talk to you just about these 5 steps. So a text feature walk looks like a couple of students working together. One person reads the text feature or reads the text feature first. They name what the text feature is. They read that text feature again. And then as a group, you have that discussion. What are predictions you have about it? Questions, connections. And then we have another person repeat steps 2 through 4 until all the text features have been discussed. When we think about this protocol, steps 1 through 3 feel like that very entry level, DOK level 1 type activities, right? We're finding it, we're naming it, we're reading it. Think about step 4. Where does that expectation live in DOK or in cognitive complexity? What do we notice about that step? Drop it in the chat. So what I notice is that that definitely is more rigorous than just that noticing it, naming it, and reading of the text feature. Here is where we're getting to the really deep comprehension aspect of that text feature. So we let students independently grapple with that DOK level 1 activity in regards to the text feature, but then in that DOK level 2 section, an activity, we are giving them support of a group to work through that together. That gradual release of a reading strategy. All right, so that talks about text features. Now, what I'd like for you to do, just like with those vocabulary indicators, AOR 7.1, 8.1, and 9.1, we're going to provide to you in the chat a link to AOR 5.1 and 5.2. So standard 5 and indicators 1 and 2 under that. Those are the ones that deal with literary text structures and informational text features and structures. What I'd like for you to look at, how are you currently instructing text structures and features, especially those literary text structures? And then how do these new standards and indicators support instructing text structures and features? I'm going to be quiet and give you about 4 minutes to access that link and do a little review. Try to answer these 2 questions. And then at the end of those 4 minutes, I want to see you share in the chat. I'll tell you, wait time is the hardest thing for me. So if you'll drop in the chat a 1 if you are ready to share your findings, just so we can kind of know.
I don't see any yet. Oh, there's one. One.
All
And
right,
I'm
we'll do
seeing
one.
and I'm seeing
Go ahead.
several in the chat. You want me to go ahead and talk about some of the
Sure.
things in the
Okay.
chat?
Angie's
Okay.
gonna kind of talk through this.
Okay, so one person mentioned that they have some amazing anchor charts from Educational Epiphany that support introducing text features. So that's good to know. Our current curriculum offers great resources and text to support instruction as well. They're very big on explicit instruction. Love that. Another person posted that I use graphic organizers and anchor charts. She really liked the text feature walk and is going to be sharing that. Love this comment. All of the standards are about gaining meaning, not just identifying text features and structures. Absolutely. Gradual increase of DOK using text features. The new standards ask students not only to analyze, but also evaluate effectiveness of author's use of text structures. Students must explain how the author's use could be made more effective. This is a higher level of thinking, which I love. Here's my favorite comment so far. I'm doing a text feature walk this afternoon and definitely plan to push the DOK based on the example given. Currently, my students would identify the text feature with ease. However, with the new standards, using the text feature walk, my students should be able to use text features to explain, describe, inform the central ideas of the content. At this point in class, no child will be left behind because everyone will have a chance to participate at free will. One more comment, this systematic implementation of both standards are more age appropriate. I think this is organized, the way this is organized will give teachers a better picture of what they should enter a grade, what students should enter the grade knowing, and what is their responsibility for introducing and teaching. Allow teachers to, allow the teacher and the student the ability to explore beyond the surface. New standards have students analyze and able to explain. Both standards indicators can be paired together and taught. We ask students to notice features and structures during their independent reading and confer with students to determine if they can explain how those structures and features help them as readers.
I love that. Your insights just, they excite me because that was the intent of the writing committee, or these were the intents of the writing committee, that students aren't just naming what the structure of literary and informational text is, but they understand its impact and they understand why an author chose that. Why did an author choose to write um, in the drama format, or why did they choose to use these text features that they included? Using the text features and using the text structures was the heart of those indicators. So I'm so glad that you're noticing that and you see a path forward with these standards and indicators. All right, let's move to our third reading strategy, and that is summarization. Now, as we dig into summarizing, I want us to look at this piece of research. Summarizing enhances comprehension. They select, condense, and synthesize in their own words, big ideas that they have learned. We know that summarization can sometimes fall in that DOK level 2 and 3 because it's such a complex system of selecting, condensing, and synthesizing your own thinking. But we don't start with DOK level 3 in those indicators. We start with DOK level 1. How do we begin to summarize? And we'll look at that in just a minute. But what I want us to notice with summarization, especially, let's look at AOR 6.1 standard. We're summarize and paraphrase text to support comprehension and understanding. In 2015, summarization looked very different. It was paired with theme and central idea. So let me go back. What do you think the intention or impact is with having summarization be a standalone standard and indicator? Why did we take away it relying on theme or central idea? Any responses in the chat?
Not yet.
That's a pretty loaded question. So I'm
Yeah.
interested to see your answers.
And super interesting. There you go. You need it for more than areas than just ELA. You summarize both fiction and nonfiction. You don't always summarize theme. It is needed in more areas.
Yes, you're exactly right. That is the heart of the reason summarization was kind of pulled out. You summarize maybe about the characters in the setting, the plot. You can summarize about an informational text. Summarization does not rely just on the theme or the central idea. And so that was one piece of impact we wanted to focus on with the 2023 standards. So, couple strategies that I'm sure you've seen before for summarizing and paraphrasing. These apply mostly to the elementary level, but it's using simple summarization like beginning, middle, and end, and then moving to maybe first, next, then last. Or we have a structured summarizing routine where we may be reading a variety of literary and informational texts in our classroom, and we are continuing to add to the summarizing routine chart in our classroom. So maybe we continue to add to the somebody wanted but so chart every time we encounter a text that we need to summarize. And if you look closely at this slide and at the somebody wanted but so chart here, you'll see literary text like The Big Bad Wolf being used in the somebody wanted but so chart, but you'll also see informational text, like a passage on Anne Frank or Adolf Hitler, or Christopher Columbus, or Thomas Edison. So summarization, that paraphrasing, can be applied to various genres. And it should be something that is a routine that you practice consistently in the classroom so that students are able to use that routine to then summarize orally, to then summarize in written form.
Real quick,
So,
Mandy.
Go ahead.
Real quick.
Yes.
Something in the chat, it says Dr. Tiffany Osborne posted AVID strategy. You summarize your own notes. What is that? What is the AVID for those like me who are not familiar with that one? Dr. Osborne, you want to unmute and let us know what the AVID?
I'm just trying to find that microphone.
Okay.
So it's advancement via individual determination. It's actually an international program. It's really a system of research-based strategies, and Cornell note-taking and then summarizing those notes is one of the strategies that they endorse.
I love it. Then there was a question about, would these simple structures be used in K through 5th?
I think that they're definitely applicable in K through 5. And again, this is just a sampling of strategies. Casey Prince Harvey, if you don't mind unmuting, she was an avid user, so I think she can speak to that as well in regard to comprehend or summarization.
Oh, absolutely. Just agreeing with what Dr. Osborne said. There are multiple strategies within AVID that focus on summarizing, but that Cornell Notes being that central piece that students are using consistently across content areas gives them that opportunity to summarize their own thinking in addition to summarizing what an author or what a text is saying. So definitely, I see a couple of people saying AVID is the best. I would agree from my experience in the classroom and in a district that was AVID focused. A lot of great strategies there that are just best or better practice.
Thank you, Casey. And Casey, I'll offer you as the expert here. If you ever have questions about AVID and some strategies, or want to bounce some ideas off of someone that has a lot of experience with that, I will solicit Casey Prince Harvey in that capacity. I know she has taught me a lot of PD facilitation strategies that align with AVID. So great practice, Dr. Osborne. I'm so glad you brought that up. Okay, now let's take a minute to examine our practice again. So in just a second, Casey Prince Harvey's going to drop into the chat a Google Docs document of just AOR 6.1. So we're just looking at that summarizing and paraphrasing standard and the indicators below it. What I'd like for you to think about, again, is how are you currently instructing summarization in your classroom? Does that way of instructing, or the ways that you see in the buildings or districts that you support? Does that align to the 2023 standard expectations? And then how can we do anything to shift or continue to implement our summarization strategies with alignment to AOR 6.1 in the 2023 ELA standard? So think about what you're currently doing, compare it to the standards, and then think about how can we continue to use that practice and refine it to support comprehension and summarization. So this time I'm only going to give you about 3 minutes, but take a look at that link. I'll try to be quiet.
All right, we have a few things in the chat already. We'll give it a few more minutes or a minute or two. All right, Mandy, you want me to go ahead? Has it been 3 minutes? I have a hard time with waiting too. Okay, so here's a few things that are pertinent from the chat. First, Dr. Osborne posted a book. It's called Summarizing in Any Subject. Apparently, it's got 60 strategies for summarizing. That is impressive. I haven't seen that. That's awesome. Summary frames for different informational text structures, such as compare and contrast, text summaries, description text summaries. Here's one again from Dr. Osborne about using a RACES. So RACES is a strategy school-wide to answer text-based questions from the paragraph. So R is restate, A is answer, C is cite evidence, E is explain, S is summarize. Teach summary using nonfiction frames, ensuring that the students under key academic vocabulary such as key details, plot and theme, display then standards and annotate the academic vocabulary on anchor charts, refer to it often, which reinforces the multiple times they need to be exposed to the word. Informs them of the transition words and phrases that are relevant to the structure. Ooh, that's a good one. Say, mean, matter strategy. Is everybody familiar with that one? Okay. And then here's my personal favorite. Again, kids have to be able to talk about it before they can master it in written language. So again, that's making that connection between that oral language and written language. Absolutely. Focus on main idea details for content areas and literary focus on story maps. I currently use the 5 W's and H strategy when working with students. As it pertains to the new indicator, I would have students paraphrase more, develop questions to check comprehension. They currently are using Plot Mountain Graphic Organizer for literary text, focus on central idea, key details, graphic organizers, teachers helping students process what they read to break down the information into important versus important parts. And I think that's really important, especially with some of our curricular areas where students might not know yet what are the most important parts of what they're reading.
I love hearing your answers in the chat. It reminds me of something that we hold true in our office, especially the ELA standards team, is that we may be the experts on the standards because we live and breathe them every day, and in and out. That is our charge, is to know these standards. But you all come to us knowing instructional practice and what works best for students, and so hearing your answers in the chat really informs us, and it impacts the entire state to hear and share these ideas. Thank you for engaging in that and for sharing with us. I see so many places to refine my practice around summarization and when I work with students. So I'm excited to capture this chat and then go try some of these activities, even with my own little boy who we are trying to prepare for school next year. So thank y'all. Anybody else want to unmute and share anything about summarizing or paraphrasing?
I'll share something. I think that one activity I used to do in the classroom that I thought was kind of interesting is we would kind of have groups. We would get the kids in groups, and they would create like, it's almost like when you tell it, if you've ever done that story where one person adds a line and then the next person adds a line. Okay. Well, then one person would add something that they thought was important. We were trying to find the important stuff that would end up creating a summary. And so then one person would add an important idea, then the next person, and the next person, and then we would have our summary of the important details, and then they would swap with groups. And so then the other groups would then provide feedback, and they would talk about what, okay, well, what might be missing in this summary, or what was great, or what, should be added. So it was really great, A, for them to converse, B, for them to practice those skills, and C, the more they see it, the more they practice, the better they are at getting to the important details to write a summary. So and it was fun for them. It was something I taught fourth grade, so they enjoyed doing that.
Oh, that absolutely, that builds that automaticity and their ability to analyze what someone else produces. So I love that activity. Thank you, Tab, for sharing with us. Okay. That brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today. So it's time for a little clarity and closure. We're a little ahead of schedule, so hopefully you'll enjoy getting out a little early today. But before we close, I do want us to think about the content that we learned today. We're going to think about it in regard to 3 C's. Something that maybe challenged your thinking, something that maybe challenged the practices that you currently have, and one area where we can commit to a change. So when we think about what challenged your thinking, what was something that was presented maybe in the first section that was so research heavy, and that content development section that maybe challenged your thinking that you hadn't considered before? We want you to think about something that maybe challenged your practice. In section 2, when we really talked through strategies of making those mental movies or using etymology to inform maybe some of your word study, Greek and Latin roots, or the text structure or text feature walk, any of those activities, did any of that challenge your current practice? Or maybe gave you a challenge of something you want to try with students? And then finally, is there anything that you can commit to as a change, or just to support your current practice? Maybe you heard something mentioned in the chat or something mentioned in our discussions that you're like, yeah, you know what, I do that, and I want to reinforce that was a good practice. I'm going to continue that because it does align to the standards, and it will help us have more than 54% of our students meet or exceed on SC Ready. So think about that for just a minute and drop some of your answers in the chat as you feel comfortable, of course.
All right, and I'll just read them as they pop up for us. So it says, I like the new standards as it seems to be geared towards having students understand, process, break down relevant information to summarize a text. Instead of just stating what figurative language means, give the students the background of where it was first used or where it came from. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that just from the standpoint of, again, circling back to narrative. We as humans are wired to learn and remember through story. So if you think about it, that's why students tend to struggle a little bit more with your memorization of multiplication facts, but they can tell you exactly what happened on the last episode of their favorite TV show or the last movie that they saw. It's because we're wired for that story, and that helps us to remember. Plan to refine my my practice with Greek and Latin roots to be more collaborative.
And I will tell you, if
Yes.
you look at the vocabulary support document for support with Greek and Latin roots, there's a suggested scope and sequence, not required. So make sure you hear us say that. But if you need some support with Greek and Latin roots, there is some resources available in the vocabulary support document.
With some additional support documents that help look at that through a scope and sequence. I have a thought about language comprehension versus reading comprehension and how language skills must be developed with good instruction. Oh, that makes my heart so happy. Yes, language comprehension. How important all of those features of language, the phonology, phonological awareness, morphology, the syntax, the sentence structure. And I'd already put in the chat about how there's going to be a whole other webinar we do just on vocabulary, but how it overlaps with all of these different standards and indicators and all of those other aspects of language. So it's going to have a lot more of an application slant to it.
All right. Well, we will close out our time together today. In the chat and on the landing page, you will see a place to access our feedback survey. Those of you that are repeat attenders, you are familiar with our feedback survey. That is where we collect information to inform our practice and our next steps. So if you will, utilize the link to that feedback survey and just give us a little feedback on our presentation today. The title of our presentation was AOR in Reading Comprehension. When you select the drop-down menu of presenters, you'll see my name pop up. You won't see Angie's name, but if you'll type in that first text box, I think maybe it follows your scoring rating. Just type in Angie's name so we know we can capture that information that she was also our presenter today. This feedback survey is just for our office, and so sometimes it's a little difficult trying to cross collaboratively partner and include both of the presenters since it's a different office. Anyway, okay. Additionally, on this slide, you see my contact information as well as Angie's contact information. If anything presented today made you pause and have a question, or maybe you want to talk through your next step with any of these reading strategies, we would love for you to reach out to us by email. We have provided that on this slide. And then if this was something that you enjoyed, something that really excited you for next steps in your classroom, we invite you to join us for part 2 of reading comprehension and the AOR. This webinar has not been shared for registration yet, but if you would like to attend, we will be sending out that information a little later this week, so we can get you registered for that. It'll be May 13th from 10 to 12, and then we have a 12 o'clock webinar as well. So it'll be a busy day if you want to attend that day, but we would love for you to hear part 2. Angie, anything else?
Just that somebody asked when the vocabulary PD will be, and that Casey Prince Harvey typed that in the chat that it will be April 15th.
Yeah, it's tax day, everybody. Ooh.
Easy to remember.
But that one will be led by Angie Neal and our other ed associate, Casey Prince Harvey. So I'm excited for that coming up as well. Thank you for our SCDE partners who were here today. We have, I want to mention Tabitha Hughes, our middle level ELA ed associate. She's been here helping run behind the scenes, as well as Casey Prince Harvey, who works on our ELA team as well. So I just wanted to give them both a shout out for being here. Angie?
Real quick, there's a question part 2. Will that come to us or will that be in a state memo?
Yes. So anyone that's registered for today or for this webinar series, I will just send it out to you as our distribution list. So if you're getting too many emails from Mandy Hawker, you may have to put me on the junk file and send me to that box. But no, you will get that information because you've registered for our webinar series in the past.
And then how do they register for the April 15th webinar?
Casey Prince Harvey, can you drop that into the chat? I can't see her, so.
I know. I love having these extra hands here with us because it's a lot to do while you're presenting and monitoring the chat and all the things.
Yep. Sorry. Yes, I'm grabbing it right now.
Thank you,
Okay.
Casey. Yes, we are quite reliant on each other. Okay, Angie, Casey, Tabitha, and I are going to listen and linger. If you have any questions or you want to hang on and talk to us, please stick around. We'd love to answer your questions. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes.
And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, thank you so much for staying and listening and for your interest in this topic, and even the people who are as excited about the research as I was. All right, somebody has their hand raised. Dion, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. I've only been in South Carolina for 2 years, in Richland 1 as well. I've relocated